So these are what we call freezies.
I'd call this a popsicle.
In British English, this a popsicle.
This first one is definitely the letter Z, although as a child we watched the American version of Sesame Street and they tried to get me to learn it as the letter Z, but this in Canada is definitely the letter Z, X, Y, Z.
I would definitely call this letter Z.
Interesting. For me, in the UK, in British English, it is the letter Z as well.
So this is definitely a bill in Canadian English. When you're at a restaurant and when you're done eating, you ask your server if you can have the bill.
The check is the most common, but I would also call this the bill.
This is always the bill.
If you're going to go out for a walk or a run, you put on your running shoes or you put on your runners.
There are lots of different terms I might use for this. Tennis shoes or running shoes, even though they might not specifically be for tennis or running. Also sneakers.
In general, we call these shoes trainers. Trainers.
Sometimes we might say sofa, but usually when we see something like this, we say, I'm going to go sit on the couch.
I would call this either a couch or a sofa.
We would almost always call this a sofa or sometimes a settee.
The $1 coin in Canada has a loonie on it. That's a bird that lives in northern Canada. So we decided we would just call this the loonie. Then when we decided to have a $2 coin, we thought we would call it a toonie because it's worth $2 and it rhymes with loony.
Slang for $1, a buck.
So we don't have dollars in the UK, we have pounds. And our slang term for £1 is a quid. And we haven't thought of a cool name for two. We call it 2 quid. 1 quid, 2 quid. Another thing to note is when we have £5 or 5 quid, we'll call it a fiver. And for 10, a tenner.
In Canada, we would call this pop.
In the US, we use either soda or pop, depending on the region. I personally use soda.
In the UK, it's very different. You will find some people, I think more up north, saying pop. But in general, we call it fizzy drinks.
In Canada, we use the metric system, so we measure distance in kilometers, but that seems like a really big word, so sometimes we just say clicks. Sometimes it's spelled with a C, sometimes with a K.
I would call that 1 kilometer, but of course in the US, we're much more familiar with miles.
So we're quite boring here, we would just call it a kilometre. But sometimes when we're running or doing sport, we will just shorten that down to K. So I love running and I like to run 5K and 10K, 5 kilometres, 10 kilometres. Let's talk about this one. This is what I actually celebrated this weekend that's just gone past.
In Canadian English, we would call this either a stag and doe or a Jack and Jill.
That would be a bachelor party for a man, a bachelorette party for a woman.
In the UK, we say hen do. A do is a party, or a stag do. Okay, this next one is an interesting one, and I kind of just put it in for Bob. Let's see what he says.
Canadians often add the word a to the end of a sentence to turn it into a question. So I can't really explain how it works, but I'll give you a few examples. I could say, it's a nice day out here, eh? Or I could say, it's getting hot out here, eh? Or if it was getting a bit windy, I could say, it's getting windy out here, eh? All of those would be examples of how Canadians use the word a.
Common question tag in the US would be, right?
In British English, we do use a sometimes, or isn't it or doesn't it? We do say a lot, it's hot, isn't it? Sometimes we can shorten this down to in it. It's hot, innit? Oh my God, in it.
So Canada is a pretty big country, and in different parts, I think they have different words for this. We call them smokes. In some parts of Canada, they might call them darts, but most people, I think, just call them cigarettes.
I don't smoke, so I'm not super familiar here, but I would say cigarettes, or for shorter or for slang, ciggies or smokes.
In British English, cigarettes or ciggies. We also use the word fag, which if you use it to describe a person, it's a really offensive word, but it's a common slang term for cigarettes.
So these are what we call freezies.
I'd call this a popsicle.
Okay, so yeah, we'd definitely call in British English this a popsicle, but we would also call it a lolly.
In Canada, we would call this homo milk or whole milk.
That would be whole milk.
Okay, so if someone asked me for homo milk, I would not know what they're talking about. I would understand whole milk, but in the UK we tend to call it full fat milk or full cream milk.
So we would call this either a parking garage or a parkade. When you go to see a show in a city like Toronto, you park your car in a parking garage or in a parkade.
I would call this a parking garage.
For me, this is a multi-story car park. We do have a habit of overcomplicating things. We always call this a car park, and if it has multiple levels, it's a multi-story car park.
So we would call this a washroom in Canada. I still remember one of my first visits to the US when I asked someone if I could use their washroom, and they looked at me funny because I think they call it a bathroom there. But in Canada, this is definitely a washroom.
I would call this a bathroom, or we would also say restroom.
Interesting. In British English, we'd understand washroom and restroom and bathroom, of course, but we tend to call it the loo or just simply the toilet.
We would call this either a fire hall or a fire station.
Fire station, but also firehouse.
Interesting. For us, this is just a fire station. We never ever say fire hall or, what was the other one? Firehouse. No, we never say that. Fire station.
In Canada, we often refer to electricity as hydro. Sometimes there's a storm and the hydro goes out. The poles along the road are called hydro poles. So I think this is because a lot of our electricity comes from hydroelectric power plants, but in Canada, you call electricity hydro.
We call that electricity.
In British English, we call this electricity, the electric. We also say the power, so we have a power cut or the power's gone out, or energy. You know, my energy bill's gone up so much. This is because we use lots of different sources. There's gas in many houses. Oil is what we use here. It depends if you're on the mains supply or not.
Call this either brown bread or whole wheat bread. It's more common for me as an older Canadian to call it brown bread. I think for my kids they would call this whole wheat bread, but definitely when I was growing up we had white bread and we had brown bread.
I would call that whole wheat bread.
I'm definitely seeing more similarities between Canadian English and British English than American English and British English. We also call this brown bread. Multigrain and whole wheat is also creeping in. But in general, we have brown bread, white bread.
So this is what we in Canada would call a serviette.
That's a paper napkin.
In British English, we use both. Serviette and napkin.
We call a case of beer with 24 bottles in it a 2-4 in Canada. Do you get it? There's 24 bottles of in it, 2-4. So we call a case of beer with 24 bottles of in it a 2-4.
We would call that a case of...
In British English, we would call this a 24 pack. If someone asked me for a 2-4, I don't think I'd know what they're talking about, but I like that. That's very efficient. Right, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much to Bob and Rachel for their fantastic explanations and for generously participating in this video.